Thank you. And it's a great day to serve and to continue to serve. And as soon as General Taguba comes in, we'll kick this off. We have a very special guest speaker today, and we look forward to introducing Colonel Thomas Hobbs. All right, sir, we see you.
Yeah, you see me now?
We see you.
Let's see, who do I see here? I see Earl Sims, General Earl Sims. Did we wake you up, Earl, or you okay? My buddy there. I got my nephew, Chris Sabaluko on there, Keith Horikawa. Who else is on there? Tina Carol Garrison, logging in. Olivia. So let's wait a few minutes.
All right, so you got Alan Lancet on cell phone. I'm in a mountain, so I don't have a whole lot of Zoom bandwidth.
Okay. You don't have enough? Can we manage up to 50?
You should be able to, sir.
Okay. Pete, how's Florida? Oh, he's on mute. Pete, if you hear me, give me a thumbs. Oh, there you go.
I can hear you. Good, sir.
Sounds good.
It's rainy season.
I know. Good thing, though, I don't have to do yard work. So.
Sure.
Wait another couple of minutes, you think?
We give it a couple more minutes, sir.
Okay. We're operating on the PPALM account, right?
Yes, sir, we are.
Okay.
Mr. Story, your mic is not muted. Just
All right.
Anybody watch the Nats? For those of you in the area, the Nats Braves game last night.
No.
Anybody here interested in baseball? What about the Chiefs and the Texans? That was a good game. No, not that either. Anybody watch badminton? That's a boring game. Nobody's into badminton?
watching the U.S. Open, sir.
Oh, okay. That's right. Tennis. You're talking about tennis, right?
Sure.
Yeah. How's everybody at? Or Becky Sampson is on. Okay, 2 more minutes and then we start. Yeah, I guess college football starts, well, Clemson and Wake Forest goes on, and there's another game before that, I think.
I believe it's UF
There's
versus
several on
somebody
now,
else.
sir.
What's that?
I believe it's UF versus I forgot who.
I think USF in Central Florida, something like that.
That would be an interesting game.
Yeah. Open season. Okay, 1 minute. Who is SM iPhone?
Hey, sir,
This
good
is
morning.
Alan Lancetta. I'm on iPhone. With
Oh, okay. Becky Sampson, are you listening in?
Yes, sir. Sam Brave from Hawaii listening in. Over.
Okay. That must be your buddy, Tom. Cliff Chen. There you go. Cliff Chen's on.
Yes, sir. I'm up.
Okay. Sorry to get you up so early, man.
No worries, sir. I made it.
Oh, 7 o'clock in Hawaii. Jeez, you guys are still slumbering.
Yeah, it's early.
Okay, let's go ahead and start, and then so we can get Tom on cue. All right. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are around the world. I was expecting Flip Capistrano from Brazil to join us, but I think Tina, she's on cue here. But thank you for joining us for our PPALM second virtual seminar. Judging from our very first virtual seminar which was successful in having a dialogue on important subjects like leadership in crisis. And I hope the topic for today, diversity and inclusion, will evoke and invoke the sensitivities and consequences that affect our lives and professions, especially during this time of crisis besetting our country. And we provided all of you, I hope, with a few reading items as point of references for the seminar. But let me start with a series of historical perspectives that somehow emanates and relative to what we're doing today, this afternoon. So in June 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt, signed Executive Order 8802 that prohibit ethnic and racial discrimination in the nation's defense industry. That means the military as well. It was not a law, but it was an attempt to promote equal opportunity and prohibit employment discrimination in the United States. Now, this executive order largely affected Italians and German citizens in the US during World War II because, the focus was Europe. Then in February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 that led to the displacement of over 120,000 Japanese Americans and were placed in 11 internment camps across the United States. And this is the intent of this executive order was to protect America from Japanese incursions and any suspicions that they were spying on the United States. But this led to the formation of the 100th Battalion, Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and Military Intelligence Service with over 16,000 Japanese American soldiers who served in combat in Europe and Pacific. These units were awarded some 21 medals of honor and thousands of casualties to prove their citizenship and loyalty to our country. In July 1941, President Roosevelt issued a military order to General MacArthur in the Philippines to mobilize all organized units under his command, whether it's the Philippine Scouts or Philippine Commonwealth Army, and organize them to defend the United States, as it says on the order, in the Philippines. And some 200,000 to 400,000 Filipino and Americans were served there. And of course, it was a tragedy there as well with Bataan and Corregidor. In 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was repealed by Congress in order to recruit and enlist some 12,000 Chinese Americans to serve in the armed forces, much needed in China. In July 1948, Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 that abolished discrimination in the armed forces on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. And while these actions were taken to ameliorate racial divide in the armed forces, it was very uneven and very inconsistent in the manner it was to be executed in the ranks. In other words, the services were integrated, but there were no consistent, relevant programs to advance equality and fairness. When I was commissioned in 1972, the term race relations was in place. In fact, my first assignment as a second lieutenant, and one of my additional duty was to be the brigade race relations officer. It was a program relegated only to data collection, like how many blacks and how many whites and how many Asian Americans and the like. I was not trained to be a race relations officer, rather than it was presumed I understood what that was, what that meant, only because of my color and my nationality. I still remember my boss, Major Sullivan, who pointed at me and said, "You'd be a good race relations officer." You know, and I needed the job. So that was replaced by equal opportunity, then affirmative action, and now we have diversity and inclusion. Our armed forces have struggled in developing a consistent and coherent program when it comes to addressing racial inequality, which is broad, but it also includes institutional bias. We don't use that term loosely now, but it exists in the professional advancement of our troops, sexual harassment and abuse, gender discrimination, religious disparities, sexual orientation, and standards and policy. The Department of Defense gave this responsibility to the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute in Florida, so far removed from the Pentagon. Now, this complex dilemma have cost the lives of troops and family members, and there were recorded incidents that reflect the difficulties of having an imperfect solution to addressing diversity and inclusion. So let me cite a couple of incidents some of you may remember. In 1996 at Fort Meade, Maryland, we used to be a training base, a female trainee reported to her chain of command that a drill sergeant was sexually harassing her. This turned out to be into a massive criminal investigation that led to a similar incidents in other training bases across the country, where drill sergeants were openly preying on female soldiers for sex and other circumstances. Reliefs of high-ranking officers, to include 2 or 3 general officers, and indictments of several drill sergeants took place. It took a few more years before Congress intervened in ensuring a sexual harassment and response program, now called SHARP, in place. However, there are still questions given the misogynistic nature of our services. I recall when Corporal Harry Liu, a Marine, and Private First Class Danny Chu committed suicide during combat operations in Afghanistan, who both of them endured a series of hazing rituals from their NCOs and officers in their respective units. Both were Chinese Americans wanted to serve their country, both young men, and who entrusted their superiors to train and protect them from the enemy. Instead, they were subjected to brutal rituals that led them to take their lives. Court martials of those charged with negligence netted very minor punishments, 30-day suspended sentences or 30 days in prison. In Private Chu's case, the Army called on me to help in finding a resolution to his case and act as a liaison to the Organization of Chinese Americans, or OCA, a highly powerful and influential community in the country. The most difficult task for me was meeting Danny's parents, who spoke no English, and in trying to explain why their only son was abused by fellow soldiers. Then having me testify to a congressional panel why hazing in the Army and Marines were occurring in the ranks. Some 4-stars said there were only aberrations and it was not consistent within the ranks, except it was happening. And I thought that my son could have been PFC Danny Chu or Corporal Harry Liu. Now, the outcome of this tragedy was the inclusion of hazing in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Harry and Danny's parents wanted justice, and this is not what they expected. My personal thought were this should have been considered as hate crimes. Now we're dealing with issues in promotions and advancements, unfair treatment or mistreatment of troops, lack of trust and confidence in the chain of command, LGBT issues, even when don't ask and don't tell was repealed, policy was repealed, and a varied list of social injustice issues. I have been mentoring an Army civilian GS-14 employee who has a PhD in education with her sexual harassment and employment lawsuit against her supervisor. She had reported the situation before the lawsuit a couple of months ago, but the garrison commander did not take active action against her supervisor, who is also serving as a deputy garrison commander. Having dealt with similar cases when I was on active duty, the command typically loses or settle out of court. What is not taken into consideration are unintended consequences that follow the command, the commander, the victim, and perpetrator, which is called a toxic command climate that exists. A case in point is what's been happening at Fort Hood, Texas today. Congress is once again involved, and there will be forcing demands by Congress that will take over the leadership roles of the Army. It puts the Army and every commander in that corps or across the country on video. Now, Secretary Esper directed the formation of 2 advisory groups on diversity and inclusion. And I suppose it merits studying this again, since we did not exhaust and enforcing nor improving the previous policies and programs. The people and formations do change in the armed forces, but the policy and programs ought to change as well, but must be relevant, coherent, and enforceable. Now, on the good side, women in the uniform are given open opportunity to serve in tactical units. We now have female tankers in the Army, infantrymen, rangers, special forces, and even flying fighter jets and commanding ships in the Navy. And it's also serving at the highest levels in the military hierarchy. But then there are subtle biases from within the military, especially the top level. We must acknowledge and a modicum of improvement in promoting diversity and inclusion. There is so much more to do. There are so many more people, thousands of them, that may be affected. So bottom line, our services are full of men and women entrusted in the care of America's best leaders. Their loved ones expect they be trained, cared for, made successful in their careers. Their families' health and welfare are equally addressed with their needs. Families are still part of the force. My mentor, who occasionally tormented me, was to maintain a positive, healthy, safe command environment where troops and families can trust and confide in the chain of command. He reminded me as a commander, my solemn duty is to resource the troops and families for success. That is true in most cases, where 95% of my time was with dealing with personnel issues and 10% of my time commanding. It won't be perfect, he said, and I won't be in command for long, 2 years at best. It would be much shorter command experience if I screwed it up. That I will be appreciated for doing my job or be vilified or labeled as a toxic leader. Now, diversity and inclusion has a purpose and not to be used as another bumper sticker or a slogan and not taken lightly. There are people who are principally involved in diversity and inclusion because they are the treasure that we rely on and represent the honor and values of our revered institution called the Armed Forces. Should be a top leadership issue above mission success. I hope you will enjoy the presentation by Colonel Tom Hobbs. So back to you, John, for the rest of the program. Thank you.
All right, thank you, General Taguba. Major General Tony Taguba, U.S. Army retired, is the chairman of PPALM. Most folks know that. Again, welcome to our second installment of Leadership for All. And for those who helped put this on, we've got over 20 participants, but the great news is, this is going to be rebroadcast to the entire world. It is a distinct pleasure of mine to introduce today's guest speaker. And having read Colonel Thomas Hobbs' articles, both his 2019 article and his most recent article of the same topic in the Marine Times, sir, it really does hit close to home. But thank you for allowing me, sir, to introduce Colonel Thomas K. Hobbs, United States Marine Corps, retired. Colonel Hobbs is a graduate of Vanderbilt University, and he has spent 27 years in uniform as a leader with service around the world, both in combat and key billets supporting the infantry and training and education, both within the Marine Corps and the joint community. Notably, Colonel Hobbs has served as the commanding officer of the Enlisted Infantry Training School and director of the Marine Corps Instructor School. Additionally, as a staff platoon commander, he served 4 rotations at the Marines Basic School. He also attended Japan's National Institute of Defense Studies, where he worked with some pretty high-level executives and continues to do that to this day. Over the past 7 years, Colonel Hobbs continues to passionately serve alongside his wife, Jennifer, and his 2 children, son and daughter. Son is in high school and his daughter is in college. Currently, Colonel Hobbs works as a consultant to the Commanding General of the Marine Corps Training and Education Command. And with that, sir, it's a pleasure to introduce you to the team. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you very much, John. I didn't know your email was going to turn into such a homework assignment. I really appreciate that. It's the longest one anybody's ever given me. And General Taguba, thank you so much for inviting me and trusting me to talk. I know I'm an unknown quantity to everybody. So thank you, everybody on the line, ladies and gentlemen, for allowing me to talk a little bit. I'm assuming everybody's read the article, so I won't talk too much about what was in it, but I'll talk a little bit about what led up to it. So I would say for 27 years that I was in the Marine Corps, I was a classic non-racist, not an anti-racist. Even though I intellectually understood, for instance, that African-American men are likely or way more likely than any Caucasian male to get shot for over a minor traffic violation. So I understood that on a mental level, intellectual level, but I didn't really feel it viscerally, right? But that changed last year, about a year and a month ago, when the El Paso shootings happened. So for the first time in my life, I realized that I could get gunned down or my family could get gunned down just because of the color of my skin. And everything changed after that, right? So it really hit me in the gut. And so I went back to work. And at the time, I'm still same place, contractor in a company that's mainly Marines. And one of my peers works there, a longtime peer from the Marine Corps. We're the same class. And he voted for Trump, and he always talks about politics. But that day, the discussion was a little different because I was so emotional about it. And at the end of really, it was almost became an argument. He said, "Well, I'm not racist. Why are you mad at me?" And then he can happily return to work, where for me, it was an existential crisis. So that's the first time I kind of understood that it was his privilege to be able to go to work and continue as if the conversation didn't happen, doesn't affect him. And I also understood that being non-racist, because he wasn't racist, he isn't racist, but being non-racist isn't good enough because you let the rhetoric go. You don't counter rhetoric like our president is putting out now, and you don't counter the white supremacists that are on the rise now. And then we have things like El Paso happening, in addition to all the shootings we hear about every week to Black men and women who are Americans. We as a military, we know that we wouldn't treat enemy combatants that way in Afghanistan and Iraq, the way we treat our own citizens. So I wrote the article, and interestingly, since the article was published, Many of my African-American officers that they were my platoon commanders 20 years ago, and we've maintained contact for over these years. They never talked to me about race. Even though I'm brown myself, and I consider myself pretty progressive, they still did not talk to me about race until I publicly declared where I stood, and by publishing an article. Then they talked to me. So over the past, since the article's been published several months now, I've learned a lot more. And the reason why the basic school fails so many people that are not white males is for several reasons. And I've learned, and I've just written another op-ed and submitted it this morning, and it covers where I fell short on the first one. But I think the number one thing is the pressure to assimilate. So yes, the socioeconomic backgrounds, especially among African Americans, can affect how they shoot, land, nav, and swim, which in turn affects their confidence and lineal standing. All that is still true. But the real pressure, the real reason we have so much difficulty in the Marine Corps retaining minority officers and women is because they feel excluded, because we are a white male culture. 95% of all the leaders are white men. So we have several examples of general officers that speak with a country accent, right, with bad grammar, say ain't, yet they make general officer. I can't imagine one single African American that retains an inner city dialect that would make captain, right, or go beyond captain. So there's a lot of adjustments. So at this competitive 6-month school, not only are minority officers and women learning new skills, but they have to learn to break themselves down and then rebuild themselves in an image that is not threatening to white male culture. And I think it hurts African Americans and probably women the worst. Why? Because I do believe American society racks and stacks minorities by threat level. And at the top of the food chain in terms of threat is African Americans. And for a while, Asians were at the bottom, at least during my lifetime. We might have gone up a tick now with what Trump calls the Kung Flu virus, right? So we might have moved up a tiny bit in threat level. But generally speaking, African American men have it the worst in the Marine Corps. And I would say women too, because we're a very masculine culture. And it's very hard for a woman to correct a man without a man feeling like he just got belittled. So there's a saying that what do women fear most from men? And that is being murdered or raped. But what do men fear worse from women? Being laughed at. So that culture is very hard to overturn in the Marine Corps. Another reason why we fall short is the Marine Corps is the basic school is a 6-month school. And it's been 6 months for the past 40 years or more. But when we designed that 6-month school, yes, there are a certain amount of topics, but we're also focused on a very narrow segment of the population, that of white males. So in the same way that SATs are not really standardized for everybody in America, they're really standardized for those that are lucky enough to be in the middle class and upper middle class white typical education pipeline. Now the SATs are standardized for them. But anybody outside of that is not standardized test. So I would say the basic school is the same thing. So we're still so industrialized in having a 6-month pipeline. But as we broaden the kind of people that join the Marine Corps, so women and minorities and different cultures, that 6-month schedule that is built on a white segment culture of the culture, a white male segment of the culture of the population, how can that school necessarily fit for everybody? So in a study I read recently, it talked about inner city teachers that are very effective with their inner city students. And regardless of the teacher's race, those students that really learn from the teachers say there's one thing in common about these successful teachers, and that is those teachers empathize with the students and they meet them halfway. So I would say a 6-month school that is built with blinders on, that only looks through a lens of white male culture, it's not enough for those that come outside of that culture. So we as a Marine Corps need to meet those people halfway and to raise them up into a level that's familiar and where they can then start at the same point as their white male peers. So those are some of the things I've learned since I wrote that article. And let me just change topics real quick. I will say that, my whole entire Marine Corps career, I've almost always been one of the few Asians or brown people in the room. And now I know what it's like for my white peers, looking at everybody on the screen. You look like me. It's wonderful. And it feels amazing. So some of the things I learned are related to that, just feeling included just by the way you look. It's amazing. Now, until so here's some things. I just attended a National Naval Officers Association conference on the 5th of August. and the Commandant of the Marine Corps spoke at the time. There was two problems. The first problem was that the NNOA was not going to ask the Commandant of the Marine Corps any hard questions. I had submitted two questions. They had to be in writing, and the moderator would screen them. And one question was, why did the Commandant make state during his Martha Raddatz interview on ABC on July 5th, he said that the Confederate flag had been hijacked by bad organizations in 2016. So I would like to ask him, what did the flag mean in 2015? And then my second question was, would he be willing to have all his fitness reports that he wrote as a reporting senior and a reviewing officer analyzed, and then show the data by grade lineally with gender and race identified, and then go on tour with that on a big screen behind him, and then talk about his biases, and then make every officer do that. A 2012 CNA study talked about how, yes, white officers do rate those that look like them higher, generally speaking, but so do black officers. The only problem is there's only 5% black officers, so the impact they have is not as great. But that would be a good exercise for everybody to do. So those are my two questions, and they weren't going to ask him. They didn't ask him. However, the Commandant made a comment saying he wants to somehow be able to get minority Marines to talk to him, and he doesn't know how to get that to happen. So there was 500 people on that seminar that day, or that conference that day. No one said a word, and he was waiting for somebody to speak. So I jumped in, and I didn't ask the Confederate flag question, but I did ask him if he would do his fitness report analysis publicly. So the problem is, why wouldn't the NNOA push him harder? That makes me start to feel like there's a conspiracy theory. Maybe the NNOA, that's the National Naval Officer Association, maybe they only exist for their own sake. So if that's the case, then I don't know what they're doing. They should be pressuring the Commandant right now, because the mood of the country is ready for that, and they're not exploiting an opportunity. So I critiqued him pretty hard about that later. Another thing the Commandant said, though, was that the Marine Corps has done a very poor job at explaining why diversity, inclusive diversity, matters. So I found that shocking, that in the year 2020, the Marine Corps cannot explain why diversity matters. So I wrote him an email explaining it. I know his MilSec pretty well. He said he'd pass it on, but actually the Commandant spoke yesterday, and he mentioned the same thing again. They're having a difficulty explaining why diversity matters. So I don't think he read the email, and my op-ed this morning that I submitted talks about this. So why diversity matters, right? Because our Marine Corps philosophy, our warfighting philosophy, I think is brilliant. And it's based off John Boyd's theories from the Air Force, and we've adopted him as our own, even though he's an Air Force fighter pilot. But we try to create an environment with which the enemy cannot cope. So the environment that we create on the enemy is so confusing and so hard to understand that the enemy turns inward to what they can control, just like we do, at least I do. I'm very introverted. When I'm new at an office and I'm new at a job, my natural tendency is to hide in my office and organize my desk and organize my calendar and turn inward to what I can control. So therefore, I isolate myself, and now I'm an ineffective thing. So we want to do that to the enemy. We get them to turn inward to what they can control, because they can't do anything with the external environment that we create, and thereby isolate themselves, and we have our way with them. So how do we do that? We do that through tempo, and we do that through creativity. So let's talk about tempo. So how do we create a better tempo, a faster tempo relative to the enemy? Well, our Marine Corps philosophy talks about flattening the decision cycle of an organization. So how do we do that? Well, that means we push the decisions down to the lowest level so they can exploit a limited window of opportunity before the enemy can. So that means in order to do that, your Marines, my Marines, would have to know me as their boss, as well as they would know their own parents, because we know what our own parents would do on a given day, or what they would do, what want us to do in a given situation. So how do we get people? That's real intent to me. So how do we get people to understand your intent to that level? Well, you have to be completely honest, open, genuine, transparent, and frank, and you have to be yourself. So that is the only way to truly have people down to the squad leader level make decisions as if they were you. So if an African American officer or a woman officer cannot be himself or herself, then how can they possibly live that? How can they actually demonstrate intent if they can't be themselves, right? So we throw away tempo as a tool in creating an environment with which the enemy cannot cope. Okay, so let's go to the next one, creativity. So what is creativity? Creativity is nothing more then the analysis of things into their component parts, and then the synthesis of those things into of those component parts into new and unheard of things. That's creativity. So in Japan, I grew up there. My mom's Japanese, and I spent attaché time there and was at their college, immersed in their culture. But Japanese companies are very good at refining and making efficiencies in things, but they often do not make paradigm shifting leaps in creativity the way Americans do. I have a theory on why, and why is because Americans have a lot more component parts with which to work with, whereas Japanese are a 99% homogeneous society, and their companies are all made up of men from 45 to 75 or 65 from the same 10 or 12 public universities with no foreigners and no women. So how many times can we break what there's in their heads into component parts and put them in together new and unheard of ways? It's already been done. So then we look at the Marine Corps. If 95% of all the officers and leaders that make decisions come from the same segment of the population, I'm talking white males, how many times can we break their backgrounds down into the component parts and put them together in new and unheard of ways? It's been done. So by not having inclusive diversity, right, then we are throwing away a natural resource, intellectual resource of our country by only using the component parts of a narrow segment of our population. So now we've given up the one thing we really have over the Chinese and Russians. So as our peer competitors have match us or even surpass us in our technological and industrial capabilities, then it may come down to how well we train and how good our warfighting philosophies are. So that's what I think it'll come down to. So by being a homogeneous culture in the Marine Corps, we're throwing those two advantages away. So that's how I tie it to readiness. And I find it shocking that the Marine Corps hasn't been able to do that. And I talk about it, the Marine Corps is the sum of its parts in my op-ed I just submitted this morning. And those parts are white males. So they don't naturally empathize with anybody that doesn't look like them. So they have to force themselves to do that. But then of course, why don't they? I mean, you could read about it in White Fragility, but to question the system is to question themselves. And they may come to the realization that it's not just their hard work and their intellect and their talent that got them to where they are. And that's a hard thing for people to swallow. So they just turn away. And that's why we're stuck right now. So solutions, I have some solutions. The first solution would be to flood the system, right? So what I mean by that, if at the basic school, we force minority officers and women into combat arms when they don't want to, because they haven't done well at the basic school, which is a infantry school, then they're just not going to be happy. So that's poor human talent management. So we need to flood the system with people that do well at the basic school, and therefore they may want to be an infantry officer, because that's who the commandant comes from, is the infantry, except for one exception. So if therefore we need a prep school. Now it's easy to do. How do I know? Because I just got done running a prep school for 3 lieutenants out of Savannah State, 2 African-American males and 1 white female. And I had them at my house from August 23rd to September 8th when they checked into the basic school. I did it all on my own dime. I taught them how to terrain associate. I did a little bit of plotting points with them. I taught them how to shoot. Took them out of a friend's house that had a lot of land, and we shot AR-15s and some pistols, so they got familiar with that. I also got them to the pool, had them work with instructors, and then I taught them combat orders, tactical planning, and how to brief orders. And then I had a lot of guest speakers on that talked about the racial politics, racial difficulties and obstacles they're going to encounter, as well as gender difficulties they're going to encounter. It was really easy to do. And I think I can't prove a negative. I don't know how well they would have done without me, but we'll see. So that's how you can flood the system, and maybe there'll be enough leakers to make it up to 3-star level, where now they're in a small pool of about 6 general officers or so that could actually be commandant, and now we can change policy. The other one is external force and pressure. So before I talk about that, I would ask if anybody on the net today is a active duty white general. Not, probably not, right? That's who we need. So I was at the NNOA conference. Not a single white active duty general was there as a champion, right? The commandant was there as a politician, but we didn't have a single white active duty general champion. I'm also involved in another forum called the Peterson Forum, and they also don't have any white active duty senior officer champions involved in that forum. So really all these forums are a bunch of people talking in an isolated system to themselves, and they're preaching to the choir. And meanwhile, there's a movement going across the country. So I think organizations like PPALM and NNOA and the Peterson Forum, we need to get co-conspirators that are white, active duty, general officer champions that can pound the table and show outrage in a way that we cannot. Then they hand the mic over to us. And then they protect us when people come after us. But as long as we're just talking to ourselves, we are not going to make any difference. We're just preaching to the choir. And nobody here on the screen needs to know what I say because you already know it. It's other people that need to know it. And we don't have an avenue to pound the table, but white general officers do. So that's the other way. Then finally is we need to write and publish articles. So a lot of people write articles, whether at the War College or whatever the equivalent school. Those don't matter. Those get buried. They don't go anywhere. We need to write articles that the media starts printing, right? So we get exposure because we need external pressure. The Marine Corps, candlestick makers didn't invent the light bulb, and Marine Corps officers that are all 95% white. Why would they truly want diversity? Because they're going to lose power. So we need to expose it by printing stuff in the media. I would say things that even as radical, and I've been dropping this everywhere I go when I talk to Marine officers, especially minority officers, but I march on 8th and I. Not a march at 8th and I, but a march on 8th and I to protest stuff. Because now we have a window of opportunity where the mood is set for this. If we let this pass, we're going to regret it. So I'll stop talking there. But that's kind of why I wrote the article and where I've come to now. Thank you very much for your time.
Hey, thank you, sir. All right, we do have set aside some time for some questions and any other reflections. It is an intimate group, so if you would like to ask a question, please just unmute your mic and ask Colonel Hobbs that question. Thanks.
All right, folks, now's an opportunity.
I have a question.
Juan, just tell him that you're a former Marine.
Colonel Hobbs and I have spoken, sir. I would say that the things that he talks about in his article are things that I personally witnessed and experienced at the basic school when I was there, and it's basically a narrative of my experience there. It's not something that I talk about often. It's a rather dark chapter of my life. But my question to Colonel Hobbs in sharing with the group here is, sir, how do you feel the peer evaluation system at the basic school? How do you feel that these conditions are reflected in that peer evaluation system, and how does that peer evaluation system then affect the Marine Corps? How does that affect the fleet?
Yeah, I don't know how the Army does it in your version of the basic school, or the Air Force or the other services, but so the captains that run each platoon, they call them staff platoon commanders, and I was one. They're captains that just left the fleet, so they're baby captains. They haven't done a company command tour at all. So basically, they're big first lieutenants, one tour in the operating forces, and that's it. And then the lieutenants themselves at the school, there's a usually class. A platoon could be anywhere between 30 and 50 people normally. They do these peer evaluations, and a lot of times, it's driven by culture and biases. I remember as an SPC in my first platoon, who I considered to be one of the top 3 officers leadership-wise in the platoon was a female, a woman. And then the first peer evals came out, and there's only 2 women in that platoon. The first peer evals came out, she was ranked at the bottom or second to bottom, and the 2 females are generally ranked at the bottom. So I just called the whole platoon together in a passageway in the hallway outside their dorm rooms or barracks rooms, and I called them all in, including the woman was there and everybody was there, and I asked, I don't understand the divide between where I had her and where you have her. I said, does she screw you over? Is she selfish? Is she stupid? Is she lazy? No one would say she was. So I said, I cannot make you change your period vows. I can't make you do that, but I'm watching you because what you did is incorrect. Somebody better come tell me why she's last. So no one ever did, and she got moved up. So, that was a rare instance of me actually doing something right. Normally, I would not do the right thing, I think. I wouldn't see it. But it was so obvious there, I took it personal, I guess. But these peer evals, they're done by, people with the same amount of life experience as you, and then they're evaluated and made into meaning by basically a first lieutenant who just left the operating forces. So, and then they count for 75% of your grade, the period evals do, of your leadership grade, and then 25% from your staff platoon commander. And then those will drive, they count for more than anything else, more than academics or physical fitness, in your overall standing. And then you have your lineal standing the rest of your life in the Marine Corps, where you graduated in that year group. So I think the period evals need to be screened more in the same way that fitness. So related to that is our, the ESPER just directed that the Marine Corps not use photos. I guess all the services are doing the same thing now, right, for selection and promotion boards. But the Marine Corps didn't do that voluntarily. We never do anything voluntarily. We're forced to do things. But we also need to take away names. But that only fixes part of the problem, because the biases are already baked into the fitness reports of people that have been in the Marine Corps for a while. So I think we do need to, the data's all there. We do need to analyze every writer for their biases. And then we should print out a report on those biases. And the board should be allowed to see the biases of the writers of those fitness reports. And then the writers themselves, the officers themselves, we should have this record. And then we know that big Marine Corps is watching us. I think that's the only way to kind of right the ship, because just changing names and taking out names and photos, that's not enough, because things are already baked in. So this culture of peer evals, it needs to go away. It needs to be, I think the peer evals are still beneficial as a feedback loop, right? But it needs to be tempered more. It affects the lives of lieutenants too much. I didn't come into my own until I was a company commander, right? Because some people grow a little slower. So I think it shouldn't follow you for the rest of your career. If that answers your question.
It does, sir. I do recall being ranked last simply because they didn't know me. That was the explanation that I was given. We don't know you.
Yep.
Colonel Hobbs, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Peter Tan, Colonel, U.S. Army, retired. A wonderful presentation. Thanks for leading from the front. And I do have a question. I know many of us know of leaders that have been relieved because of doing the right thing. And I actually, and I know a general officer that was relieved because of command climate survey,
right,
that tried to do the right thing. And
right.
And so how much pushback have you had in trying to be the leader with the innovative thoughts that you have with regards to doing the right thing?
Yeah, I fought the system a lot as a Marine when I was active duty, but that's because I have a martyr complex. And if I could even find anything ethically wrong with my boss, I'd go head to head. I chose my battles. I was always the most polite, most tactful, until I found something I didn't like, and I'd just push it. And I always thought that was my righteousness that allowed me to, be saved in the end by somebody who looked at it from the outside. But I think part of it was I'm not African-American. Had I been African-American, I would have survived a lot of these encounters. So, I've only been really championing anything since I got out because of the El Paso shootings. I'd like to believe that had I been active duty still, I'd still be doing what I'm doing now, regardless of whether I was active duty or not. But I did lose some friends. Well, I guess the friends of the in quotations, people have dropped contact with me as a result of the article, but I've gained, way more, 10 times more as a result of it. I think that's partly why guys like General Berger are so reluctant to go publicly. And, instead of saying the Confederate flag is divisive, he's yet to say the Confederate flag is wrong. And why is he afraid to do that? Because he's going to lose friends. He's going to lose friends. So that's why no one trusts him to speak honestly. So that's why it took me putting it down on paper and risking friendships where people actually believe me. So I would say that on doing things right, I learned that when I preach a lot, I paint myself in a corner. And when you paint yourself in a corner, those around you have an expectation of what you'll do when those challenging times come. So then you have two choices. You either do what's ethically right, according to what you believe is ethically right, or you're a fraud. So, I've done some ethically right things in the past where people said it was courageous, but really, truly, I was more afraid of being a fraud. So it was almost like I had to do what I did because I don't want to be a fraud. So I think painting yourself in a corner and always preaching about what is right and wrong forces you to lift yourself up to the ideal you want to be instead of that person we naturally are when no one's looking. Just like we change our own character. If we don't like our bodies, we PT or whatever, we can force ourselves to change. So that's how I've been able to do things, even though I'm scared. Like I pretty much said I would resign my commission if I was not relieved along with a gunny. But I didn't believe the gunny was the only one at fault. I believe it was my responsibility as CEO. So I told my boss, at 19 years. I asked permission from my wife. I said, unless you relieve me too, then I will resign in protest. So, but that wasn't because I was courageous. It was because I had run my mouth so much. I was more afraid of being a fraud. Yeah, so it's up to everybody what that means, because you can always find a higher right. And in the end, everybody can question your right. So whatever causes you less, I say whatever causes me less shame, and explaining to my kids someday that I didn't make it all the way to the top because I lived by something I believe was right, or, you know, I kept my mouth shut, but I made it all the way to the top. So whatever, you know, I'm not going to judge what people think about that. It's just whatever causes you less shame when you explain that to your kids someday. I don't know if that answered your question, Pete.
Yeah, I did. I think that the biggest thing is my career, I've been surrounded by risk averse leadership.
Yes.
And so you're not even, if you're surrounded by risk aversion, that passionate person that's going to come up to the very, very top of that pile is few and far between because you have no support.
No, the cost and return on investment is poor for being bold. Absolutely. So despite our philosophy, which talks about, you know, dissent, if you feel it until the decision is made, that we take calculated risk, that we award boldness, despite all that we say in our philosophy, we don't live it. We live in cognitive dissonance. I believe that if you keep your mouth shut, and as long as you're not ranked at the bottom and you kind of go whatever way your boss goes as you go through your career, you will make it 20 years and make it to lieutenant colonel, no problem. So there is no advantage to being risky and bold. Absolutely not.
Thank you.
Come on, folks.
All right, I definitely have a question. Sir, thanks again. I know General Taguba has talked a lot about moral courage, and for a lot of folks in PPALM who are still serving, and Colonel Tan's last remarks alluded to this, but you know, in your, how can the folks still serving be those change agents and help display the moral courage needed when, you know, some of these policies that are coming down and continue to come down clearly are, you know, adverse to what we believe good order and discipline, especially when it comes to being anti-racist or just, you know, being on the fence?
That's such a hard question because it's so, once again, so personal, right? You know, I always think that, you know, when Colin Kaepernick got all that heat for kneeling, if the NFL, anybody who agreed with him, white or black or Asian, doesn't matter, but if they'd all just boycotted, the NFL would have crumbled in overnight, and then they would have hired him back with pay increase, right? But for everybody to say, I'm going to risk my family and risk my career, and risk my income, it's really hard to do unless you know everybody's going to do it, right? So it's just so personal whether or not you're willing to risk something or not. But I think the first thing is you got to have a code. So there's plenty of officers I know in the Marine Corps that don't have an ethical code. They don't really know where they stand on things. So one, you got to have a code. What are you going to let slide by, and what you're not? Or what are you not? So if you don't know yourself, you're not going to know when to stand up anyway. So have a code. Number one, decide what that code is. Then preach that code, right? And most of our codes are all going to be within the confines of the UCMJ and our Constitution anyway. So it's a variation off that. But preach your code. Then when the time comes of whether or not you're going to stand up or not, you know, you've painted yourself in a corner. So then you have two choices: be a fraud or do something. Or, you know, another one Boyd said was, you can, at some point you'll come to a crossroads. Now at that crossroads, you'll have to decide whether you're going to be somebody or you're going to do something, right? And those that choose to be somebody often don't do the right thing. Those that do something may not be somebody, may not make it to the top. But, you know, your career ends, whether it's 20 years or 30 years, and the Marine Corps forgets you, and who cares, right? But your kids don't care. I mean, your kids always care what kind of person you are. So I think you got to go back to that. Who do you want to be for your children, you know, to admire, and then act that way, if you can afford it. If you can afford it.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I do have a follow-up. When I was a captain at West Point, leading up the Pacific Interest Forum group, I had other officers, predominantly white, say, "Hey, why do you spend your time doing that?" Because what you said was all you're doing is talking to yourselves. And so one thing that we try to do is like, okay, well, we can do something about that. We try to help unite the other forums and activities that were at USMA so that we could have that common voice. You mentioned, you know, the affinity groups. Do you see that kind of at the national level, or are other groups, you know, working with a common voice, or do you still even find disparity amongst the different affinity groups that are out there, and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's not so much disparity as I'm only involved with 3, so I'm very, very small sample size. But it's not so much disparity as their own agenda or their own color or their own culture is front and center. And if it happens to parallel and match and be beneficial, mutually beneficial, then good to go, get on board. But it's not something they're actively seeking to do, I think. But I also see it down at the individual level too. I've been involved with this podcast by a guy named Mike Stebbin. It's called Confessions of a Native Son. And he's an African-American officer that wanted to be an infantry officer, 3-time NCAA champion boxing out of Naval Academy. And the Marine Corps almost killed him with the humiliation it put him through. But one of his classmates from the basic school, from the Naval Academy and IOC infantry officer course in the basic school, is a Vietnamese American. His father came over from Vietnam, and this Marine officer, he's a captain, still has a thick accent, but he did not understand where this guy Mike Stebbin came from as an African American. And I talked to him about, like, does your dad really love the American Constitution? He goes, yeah, he loves it. He talks about it all the time. I said, yeah, he's looking at it with an immigrant's eyes, and we really appreciate it. The best Americans are immigrants, I think. They really love the Constitution, and they understand how valuable, how amazing it is. And it rubbed off on his son, the captain. And I said, well, imagine being an African American, right, and being in 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow, and still not having equal, everything equal at all by any means, with all the structural racism that's out there. And for the first time, he thought about it differently. Not that I don't think he's an anti-racist in that way yet or anything like that, but we don't talk enough amongst each other, even between Asians and blacks and women. We just don't. So I think it needs to start at the grassroots level before we ever get major membership organizations to start to join efforts, I think. Over.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Any more out there, Keith? I know you're listening. Cliff?
Hey, sure. I'll just give another Marine Corps perspective on it. I never worked with Sumo. Actually, I never crossed paths with him. But, I think we both came in around that time. I went to OCS at 1988, which was kind of the same time as Bruce Yamashita, which I know a lot of people on the Army side are probably more familiar with. And I think the perspective that you might have as somebody who survives the Marine Corps system is that, most other Asian American Marine officers don't think very highly of him, in the sense that we didn't look at it like, that's a good thing that you made a lot of noise. And, because I guess for us, when you're in the system, it's a matter of, well, I survived, why didn't you survive? And it's something to come to terms with, because I know my attitude about race changed over my career, right? Because when you're a company grade, it's all about being the gray man and just trying to survive the system. So you kind of adapt the same positions as the rest of your peer groups, and you're kind of like, God, yeah, that guy is all dicked up, obviously he had a problem. It wasn't really, the instructors or, his sergeant instructors or whatever the case is. So it's kind of it's an interesting cultural phenomenon. It's something that, like Tom was saying, is that you develop things over time when you start to understand your moral position on things. So, but I mean, I think that's an interesting Marine Corps perspective on things like this, because I know most people in PPALM have an Army background, but but a lot of people have Hawaii connections, so they know that he used Senator Inouye to kind of make his point, and he had his support. But I just thought it was interesting to think about, because talking to other Asian American officers in the Marine Corps who were around at that time, most of us were kind of like, he was a pariah to us. We were like, whoa, we don't have anything to do with that guy, So it's kind of an interesting perspective from that sense.
Thanks, Cliff. And Cliff's the reason why I even found out about PPALM, so I really appreciate it, because I'm really happy to be a member. Boy, I can't tell you how welcoming this group is. Muhammad Ali said that, what was that saying, that if you are the same person at age 51 as you were at 21, then you've wasted all your life pretty much. So of course we're going to grow and change, and I wish I'd acted differently as a captain, lieutenant, even as a colonel. I wish I'd acted differently. Um, I will say one thing though, that we don't talk a lot about how racism, structural racism, causes us to act towards each other, right? And sexism too. So, you know, the moment you see another person that looks like you drowning, sometimes the first tendency is to run the other way because you want to be associated with that person, right? Which white people don't have to worry about because they're the majority culture. So we have to be aware of that and be brave enough not to be that way. I think it's very hard. And I did that too as a lieutenant and a captain. I know his name to this day, and I'm ashamed of it. But I turned away from him when I thought he was going to make me look bad because he was kind of a weirdo, a Japanese American. I will say too that speaking out though, somehow that's tied to expertise. In the Marine Corps, you do 3 years as an infantry officer. I'll give you my example. You do 3 years as an infantry officer, as a platoon commander. Then you go to a B billet or secondary billet outside the Fleet Marine Force or operating forces. Most of the time, those B billets have nothing to do with your trade. So you go be a recruiter or you work at the drill field or something like that. Then you come back as a captain. And if you believe that 10,000 hours of quality practice rule, which I do, because even in Japan, they talk about it takes 10 years to make an expert. And you do the math. If you work 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for 3 years, that's a typical tour of an infantry officer, the first tour. That's 11,000 hours, or just under 11,000 hours. But that's weekends, it's holidays, it's standing around the range with your hands in your pockets. It's not quality practice. So let's be generous and say that's 5,000 hours. Then you go off and do a 3-year tour as a recruiter, and then you come back as a company commander. You haven't racked up the 10,000 hours to be an expert, right? So you don't talk because you can't even talk about your trade. And that's why infantrymen in the Marine Corps are the most fearful of evaluations. We never get evaluated. And because we cannot measure that which is important, we make important that which we can measure, like PFD scores, how you look in uniform, stuff that doesn't matter. But I got lucky and I got picked to go to the basic school and teach, and that's an infantry school. So I racked up another 5,000 hours before I returned back to the operating forces as a captain. And I will tell you, as a company commander, you know, I wasn't, aware of all the racism, sexism, and stuff like that. But boy, as an infantryman, I knew what I was doing. And my company was a school. It was constantly a school. And I argued back with my battalion commander because I knew my trade. So that was the first step for me in being outspoken and not being afraid to go against the grain. Because if they came back at me, I could prove they were wrong because I knew my trade better than most Marine infantry officers at the tactical level. So I think that's another piece of it, component of it. I think we don't do a good job of making experts in the Marine Corps, particularly, except for pilots. They spend their entry-level pipeline is like 2 tours or 2.5 for me, for an infantry officer. So by the time they get out of the cockpit to go do something else, they are truly experts. But we don't do that anywhere else in the Marine Corps. It's all happenstance. So somehow that is tied to being courageous. I'm talking morally courageous in being able to speak up and argue back. There's a linkage there, I think. Over.
Just to offer some perspective here, you had mentioned about pressure to assimilate. There's an inversion of sort, and I know General Sims would understand this as well, and for all of you, from my own personal experience, when I was a second lieutenant going through basic course, I was with a class of 1972, West Point, predominantly white. I'm one of the very few. And there was a pressure for me to try and assimilate with them, but I'm an ROTC guy. And there's that little distinction that, man, they're all West Pointers, and I'm just an ROTC guy that came into the fold. One of the very few officers of color. So over time, I'm probably one or two that represented the color of America until I became a commander, where now I am the minority guy on top, and I'm leading all these white and black and Japanese Americans or whatever have you. And the pressure kind of mounts in that inversion that what is this guy who is not white, immigrant, barely speak English is going to do for me? So the pressure actually goes tenfold, that now you are not at the bottom of the scale, now you're on top. And over time, you're getting to see that pressure mounts because you're almost, I felt like I was always in the petri dish that what is Taguba going to do today? And so, and it's incumbent, as my mentor would say, to be visible. So you just can't hide in your office. I've had battalion commanders hide in their office, and as an XO or whatever, sends me out to do all the dirty work. But it's not as much as being curious or as a subject of curiosity of who you are and what you can do. Because in command, typically, you only have so much time. You have at least 2 years if you're lucky. And my mentor used to say, don't do everything in 90 days and don't do everything in the last 30 days of your command because you just screwed up, right? And whether it's people functions or command functions or mission functions. So those are the kinds of demands that they don't teach you in the classroom. It's an acquired skill. And this is where you seek people that you can trust, which is another term that you can say, I'm not looking for a job, sir. Tell me how I can do better and show me the way, and then I'll do the rest. We don't do that very well sometimes because we're too busy with our work and also trying to take care of the family. And by the way, you got to deal with the mission, that we forget that our company or our battalion, our brigade, our division, and our command are made up of people that you're supposed to be caring for. They're the ones that make you successful. It doesn't say on your fitness report that Tom Hobbs singularly made all these things happen. That not only did he made water, that he actually walked on water, right? It says your troops and everybody else that were associated with your mission actually made you famous. And for a person of color, it's even more indicative of how difficult it is to prove yourself. And that's one of the reasons why ROCKS was formed, PPALM was formed. We welcome everybody who wants to excel, but not necessarily where we hold your hand and say, this is what you got to do. And this is part of the diversity and inclusion, that we're not just counting numbers or asking, are you as diverse as you can be? Stupid question. And how inclusive you can. General McConville, the Chief of Staff of the Army, says, we don't have a problem with diversity. We have a problem with inclusion. I would suggest that we have a problem with diversity and inclusion, especially when 71% of the officer corps is white. How do you make it diverse when you already are demographically and proportionally at a disadvantage? I'm not saying everything is equal. I'm just saying everything has to be fair. And that's the struggle that we have today. Because we, as leaders in this forum, we're trying to bring people to join the force, not intimidate them. And then we've always, with commissioning, like my nephew who's on this seminar, he said, as a brand new second lieutenant, whatever color you are, never be that officer where people, your troops, follow you out of sheer curiosity. Whether you're white, black, brown, yellow, red, if you're in charge, you got to prove your merit, your mettle, so to speak. That you're the most highly educated young lieutenant, but the least trained and least experienced in that outfit. And you're going to have to find somebody to help you be one of them and to be trusted. And this is part of the whole issue of diversity and inclusion. Is, like you said, we don't have too many champions. Like a white general officer, I've only known of one, actually two. My Marine boss in Korea, Mike Myatt, Cobra 6, that actually nurtured me and made me tough. Otherwise, the only thing that he was unsuccessful was trying to turn me into a Marine. Rather than change all the stuff, I wore tankers boots, and he said, why are you wearing the orthopedic shoes all the time? And I told him, hey, sir, I'm an armor officer. This is what I do. And my 3-star boss at Fort Hood, they actually paid attention, not just to me, but to the entire command, so as a commentary. And I think that's what we ought to do. I've always sensed that membership in PPALM is, predominantly Army, but we do have folks all the way to Coast Guard. But we welcome anybody that wants to join and be mentored. And we'll do our very best to provide them with the best mentoring service that needs to be. So that wasn't a question, it's just a comment that based on what you were just telling me, that was pretty good. Anyone else? Earl, you want to say something?
Yes. Colonel Hobbs, I really, really appreciate your discussion. And I certainly like how you have articulated how you've approached it. My story is probably one that I appreciate, probably being one of many. Growing up, I went through a segregated system through the 8th grade, went into high school where I was the only Black in my class. There were 7 in my school that were of color. One was my sister. And so that for 4 years was something that I guess ingrained in me then by my father, that if you are going to survive in this world, you have to be 125% of what everyone else is expected at 100%. And so that mentality, it wasn't something that I looked at whether it was fair or not, but it was ingrained in me. And so really kind of how I have approached not only that, but everything else that I have taken on board, and especially within the Army. I unfortunately wanted to be an infantryman, but my PMS chose that no, you need to be an AG. That's a personalis, which I took great offense, and I turned down an RA commission as a result of that. I don't know that that was smart or not at the time. Ultimately, it came back to me. But everything that I have looked at, it has always been through that lens. In order to be equal, you got to put in that other 25% that's above that 100%. And I think that's something that I would love to be able to see for my grandchildren anyway, that they would not have to approach life that way and be viewed through a lens that I got up this morning, I'm a human being, and I breathe the same air that you do, and I should have the same opportunity. I realize that's a pipe dream, especially as we look at our environment today, because it looks like we are going in the other direction. But enough of that. I've had my one command, I had 11 Marines that were commanders under me. All of them tankers. All of them had been in the war. One of the things that they had, I guess, was most difficult in how I dealt with them was I took our evaluation system. Back then had a couple of components. It was one, you had your initial document that was given you that said, this is what my job is, and this is how you're going to be evaluated. And so I had a process with all of my I had 36 commanders at the time, that I took them through that process. And I said, we're going to write your evaluation. You're going to write that evaluation. And by that I meant I'm going to make sure I'm very clear of what my expectations of you are. And I will work with you on those areas that need improvement. And they didn't quite understand that. And so ultimately, I guess, of those that I had, 7 or 8 of them came back to me later and said, what you taught me has brought me full circle with regard to how I've become a better Marine and more competitive. Some of the officers, the naval officers, I had 2 coasties, and the rest were Army. But I approached it from the standpoint of a one-on-one. And my point to them was, I'm going to sit down with what you have as a job description. We're going to set the standard as to what the expectations are, my expectations of you, and they should be that of you, yourself. And as we sit down on a quarterly basis and talk about that, I expect you to tell me where you stand. And that's your model. It's not mine. That's your model. And so at the end of that period, you should be able to come to me and write your fitness report based on that standard. And I think looking at it through that lens, and I forced that across the force. So there was something that a lot of them didn't like, because number one, they could not very well articulate how to measure themselves. And so what they came back to me in life and said, wow, I run my organization that same way. And it is amazing how, with my help, they have improved themselves and understand where they are and can articulate that back. So with what you were talking about, I think those are some of the things that came back to me. When General Taguba and I bounded around together and we looked at taking the ROCKS model and using it, which is subsequently PPALM. Part of that process is trying to instill on a one-on-one basis how we can help individuals grow. And in this era, we still are that 125% equals 100%. You know, I'm 70 some years old, and I never thought that we would still be having to look at life through that lens. But that's life, that's how it is. And so buckle it up, and let's go on and get this job done. I compliment you for what you have done, because I know the hill that you had to climb, and especially when you're by yourself, because, you know, the Marine Corps is small, and you know, it doesn't take long for your reputation to get around. I've been there, and still up through my general officer days, I was one of a very few, as you well know. And anyhow, that was fine, because I guess my mental set had been set with my father early on. And if you're not tough-minded, then you'll be able to be coerced to do whatever anybody else wants you to do. One last story, and then I will stop. I was told as a general officer, in fact, a fellow general officer knocked on my door one day and came in and said, can I shut the door and talk to you? I said, sure. What's up? And he said, well, you know, you're being viewed as antisocial. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, you don't come out once a month when the generals come out and we go play golf. And I said, well, here's my deal. I come to work, typically get here about 6 in the morning and leave about 7, 8, or 9, depending on what task I had. And I was running the Army's personnel system, postal system, you name it. I mean, it was one of those jobs that you just didn't walk away from. And I says, I have people to take care of, and that is more important to me, number one. And I don't have the time to go back or to being out of the office for a day to go play golf just because the boss wants to play golf. And so that was my death knell. And it was fine. I understood that, but I was not going to be dishonest with myself at the expense of the people who depended upon me to lead them. And so I have looked back on that often, and people ask me, you know, well, what happened to you? I said, nothing happened to me. You know, I continued to do what I was supposed to do. The system didn't see that I was worthy to move to the next higher level, and that's fine. I'm happy because I am very confident that I gave it my best, and I think any organization I was a part of, I tried to make it better than when I first joined it. So anyhow, I really admire you from that perspective. So you've got to be true to yourself, number one. And when you are, then you can wake up every day and smile and say, I'm better as a result. And so I believe you feel that same way. And thank you for being here today. I really enjoyed your discussion. Kind of reminded me of me a little bit there.
Thank you, sir. Your words mean a huge amount. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Listen, I'm going to have to leave you, but I'm going to leave it to John to keep the dialogue going. But before I do that, Tom, very well done. Truly appreciate your insight and your foresight as well, and your courage to speak out. We need to do that more often. And this is part of that pressure assimilation that sometimes we're too silent. But there's time when you hit the pressure point that we got to speak out, and we need to do that more. Thanks for attending. I have to go to another Zoom meeting. I'm getting zoomed out today, and we're supposed to be on in 5 minutes. So, John, continue on if you would, please, and carry on. And we need to take notes on what Tom has done, and also the comments that we had as well. Like anything, like any military organization or quasi-military or nonprofit volunteer work, that we do an after action. Okay. But this is good, that we have, I consider this another A+, that we're readily open to have a dialogue that's on Zoom. We ought to do it more often.
Hey General Taguba, thank you for inviting me, having me on. I appreciate it. You and I need to get our heads together on a couple of things. I've got a mission that I'm jumping off to with the Chief of Staff.
Okay.
That I want to talk to you about because there's some things that I think we need to follow up on.
All right. Be expecting your dinner invitation, Earl, and then
okay.
See. All right. I'll sign off. Thanks again. John, take charge.
Thanks, sir.
All right. Hey, thanks. All right. If there's any additional questions, please ask them now, or I'm sure Colonel Hobbs, we have his point of contact info as well. So if there's other questions that want to be asked outside of the forum, I'm sure certainly do that too. But to create a hard stop, we'll go with 14:30 Eastern Standard Time. So we got a couple more minutes. Any parting shots or further questions?
Hey, sir, Colonel Hobbs, good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Colonel James Gaddis. I just have a quick, first and foremost, thank you for the opportunity, insight and knowledge that you have shared today. You made a good comment, or at least described something about, how different cultures, different races would tend to flock together. And you could definitely see that. If you, as an example, if you go to a brand new event where nobody knows each other and whatnot, and put them in one room, most of the time, those individuals would look for someone that would be either the same race, either the same branch of service, or whatnot. So that is a good insight. Also, for the most part, it's quite difficult for us, because comparing with other individuals or even races, because of our culture, norms, prejudices, and sometimes social classes. Asians are more reserved. They're not too aggressive at times. We tend to be more accepting to the rules, respect, and elders at the same time. So I guess my question is, with that said, how can we help shape, influence, and affect change, not only within the services, but also outside of the services? Over.
Yeah, it's a huge question, right? And there's just so many ways to attack it, but just, so I guess the easiest way to do it is, what can you change within your span of control, right? So in your own unit, what can you change? So that, you can assign reading from different cultures. You can have different people from different cultures talk about how they grew up, what it's like, for instance, why the Vietnamese American captain, why he looked at the Constitution so different than an African-American, a descendant of a slave would. So, that you just share stories. It doesn't have to be a debate. It's just a perspective that you throw out there. I think that would help. I one story, I had a Korean immigrant Marine at the school I taught at, infantry school I taught at, and he wrote a post critique, in a course critique. And in the critique, he said, "I'm glad my instructors are not racist." So, the whole chain of command thinks that's a compliment. And so I read it, and it just seemed off. Why would anybody just put that out of the blue? So I said, go back and ask him again. Why did he write it? And I made him go back twice. They keep coming back. Oh no, he just said it's a compliment. So I'm Japanese, and this Marine was Korean, so I know how we speak, which is indirectly, right? We speak oblique language, where the listener has responsibility for receiving the message, unlike our culture, where the speaker has responsibility for conveying the message. So, I actually happened to run into him at the gym at graduation day, and I saw him, and I ran over to him, and I asked him, why did you write that? And I had to pick. And finally, after me picking and picking, he said, well, we were at the chow hall, and a sister battalion, their instructors were talking about slopes and chinks and referring to their students. And he said, I never heard that in our battalion, and I was really thankful, right? So that's what thank God I picked, because then I could run over to my fellow battalion commander and tell him what was going on. But, and the reason why no one in chain of command even picked up on it, because they don't understand other cultures. I just happened to be lucky enough to have that background, so I could. But anybody else would have missed it. So, all we can do is share stories and share our perspectives and hope that people are open enough to listen. That's all I think. I don't know, that's far short of an answer, too short of an answer. It doesn't answer your question, I'm sure, but I guess that's a start.
No, sir, I do appreciate it. It is something. I mean, this topic is so broad and so complex. There is no right answer, no one specific right answer.
Right.
So any input, ideas is definitely appreciated, because what we want to do is to be able to affect change, not only for us, but for everybody else. Over.
I agree. Thanks. We're running out of time, but I would like to make one comment. In General Sims, it's not so much what you said, sir. And I know I'm at risk of sounding patronizing, and I mean this genuinely. The way you said it impacted me more than what you said, because you said it was complete, I don't know, gentleness, or just you're nice about it. So, for example, do you know Major General Cliff Stanley? He's the Marine general, retired about 20 years ago now. But when he was a captain in 1974, he was coming back from a family dinner. And he's one of the few black officers at the time. He came in '69, experienced overt racism, just like you did, sir, I'm sure. And anyway, he's come back from a family dinner, and his uncle's in the car, a couple cars ahead of him, and he's in the car with his 3-month-old daughter, his wife, and one other person. And on that day in Maryland, a white supremacist was shooting black people in the street. So he went down and shot his uncle, doesn't shoot white people, comes to General Stanley's car, shoots 2 bullets into the car, and one of them strikes his wife through the back. And so she was paralyzed. They didn't know at the time because she couldn't feel anything, and she almost bled out. But she lived, and the 3-month-old daughter lived. The uncle died. And instead of being, I asked him, how are you not, and then later when he was at Quantico as a CG, somebody hung a noose up in one of the buildings. And this is in the late 80s. So are you not full of rage and bitterness and anger? He can't be. You can't carry that baggage around. He said you can't, and you still are responsible for everybody. So you can't get hateful. So when I listen to you, General Sims, you're the same way. I don't hear any rage in your voice or anything, and I have a problem with that. I have a difficulty controlling that. I make everything very personal, and I think that can be to a disadvantage. So I think maybe the biggest lesson today for me too is just how General Sims and General Stanley are able to absorb this humiliation and hate, and then turn it around into something very positive, and not take it personally, even though most normal people would. I would. So I'm always admire people like you, sir, that are able to not turn it into rage, but turn it into something positive. So I'll try to learn from you.
Well, I tell you, thank you very much for that. I guess the rage doesn't always come to the surface where I've been able to control it. And so that's probably one of the things that's part of, everybody has a different way of looking at and leading. And that's something that I've adopted, and you still have to work at it even at my tender age. But thank you very much. Thanks what you're doing, though. I really appreciate the article and this session here.
Thank you, sir.
My compliments to you.
Appreciate it, sir.
All right. Hey, thanks everybody. Looking at Colonel Hobbs's resume, his email is up there. I think tjhobbs2@gmail.com, sir. Okay, great. Yeah, great discussion. Thank you, Mr. Story. Appreciate everybody's time. I know most folks are in different area codes and time zones. Sir, I definitely look forward to following up with you, especially as we continue to get our mentorship program launched here in the near term. But sir, any parting remarks before we sign out?
No, I'm grateful for everybody's time. I'm very humbled that you'd sit there and listen to me when you sight unseen, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, but just thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, everybody.
And let's see, Juan, I think that closes it out. So I appreciate you, Juan, for recording everything. And for all the members out there, have a great day. Aloha.